All right, everybody, I think it's time to get started. So ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to see so many of you here in the room. And from what I understand, there's also a lot of people joining us online, which we are very happy about. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Anders Olofsgård, and I'm a deputy director here at the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics site at the Stockholm School of Economics. And as I think many of you in this room know, we here at site have since February 24th been quite busy in terms of writing and organizing events on the Russian war on Ukraine. And as part of that, we have today then, jointly with the Center for Economic Policy Research, CEPR, organized this book launch of this book that is just recently released, entitled Rebuilding Ukraine, Principles and Policies. So this is a book that has been written by a long list of very prominent international scholars, jointly with local experts from Ukraine. And it's published through the Center for Economic Policy Research, then CEPR. So with us here today then to present parts of this book, we have 3 of the authors. 2 of them are here in public, 1 of them is joining us online. So in order of appearance, we have Beatrice Weder di Mauro. So Beatrice is a professor of international economics at the Geneva Graduate Institute and also a distinguished fellow at the INSEAD Emerging Market Institute in Singapore. Since July 2018, she also serves as president of the CEPR. In addition to her distinguished academic career, she has also been extensively involved in the policy sphere, serving on the influential German Council of Economic Experts, consulting for governments, international organizations, and central banks, and also served on several boards of major international private companies. Our second author who is with us today, but online, is Veronika Movchan. Veronika is a research director at the Institute for Economic Research and Policy Consulting, IER, in Kiev, Ukraine. So her main areas of expertise lies in the areas of trade policy and regional integration. Among many relevant experiences, she headed the Ukrainian team in the project Understanding the EU's association agreements and the deep and comprehensive free trade agreements with Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, implemented by the important think tank, the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. And then lastly, but obviously not least, and I'm not saying this only because he's my boss, we have our very own Torbjörn Becker, who is a director here at site and a board member at several research institutes in Eastern Europe, including Kiev School of Economics in Ukraine. Prior to joining site, he worked for 9 years at the IMF, primarily in the areas of international macro and international financial systems. So Torbjörn has published widely in the area of macroeconomics, more recently with a particular emphasis on the economics and political economy of Russia and Eastern Europe more generally. So before leaving the floor to Beatrice, I just wanted to mention a few practical notes. So I've asked our presenters to give presentations of roughly 15 to 20 minutes, which leaves somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes at the end for a Q&A session. So I will kind of moderate that session with some prepared questions, but we will also open up for the floor for questions. So please be alert and think about questions you want to ask, but hold those questions until the Q&A session. And after the presentations and the Q&A at the end of this whole presentation, then there will also be an opportunity to socialize over a glass of sparkling wine, I believe, and something good to eat outside here. If you need a bathroom, that's also where you're going to find the bathrooms. And of course, as always these days, don't be shy about using, your social media accounts, tweet and anything you want to do in terms of giving publicity to this event. But with that, please, Beatrice.
Thank you so much for having me here, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be presenting this book, more over this whole project to you today and discussing it. It's clearly something that is very much on our minds. And for the Center of Economic Policy Research has been on the top of our agenda ever since the invasion of Russia, of the Ukraine last February. to somehow think about how we as academics could support the efforts of the Ukrainian people, and also think about how we can help in terms of their rebuilding and their plans going forward. So this is actually this book, which is the cover is in the middle one, is surrounded by a number of faster and smaller reports that we did last year with a similar set of authors. The first one, which we then called a rapid response report, because it was the first time that we actually within very, very short time, 10 days, and only 1 month into the war, put together what we then called a Marshall Plan of the Ukraine. What were the principles? This is this blueprint for reconstruction. At the time, of course, only 4 weeks into the war, that seemed very, very much premature, but it was this thinking about these principles had quite an important influence on the debate. And then the second one on the right-hand side is another rapid response that was in answer to a request actually from the Ukrainian government, where back in July, they felt that they were heading straight for a macroeconomic crisis. And of course, you don't want to be fighting a war and at the same time having macroeconomic crisis. So this is about the macroeconomic policies. And finally, the Paris report. This is more of a longish book with many co-authors and many chapters, where we actually go into this. The book goes into different sections of what we need to be thinking about when rebuilding the Ukraine. So some is about institutional reforms, and it is about how to organize aid, for instance. It's about anti-corruption and how this will play out in the reconstruction. Toby will later on talk about that. And then there are more the labor markets on the one hand side, trade, integration with the EU. Veronika will be covering that, which is her chapter with Ken Rogoff. And there are chapters on the hardware and software of reconstructing. So both infrastructure, energy, for instance, but also the software, the human capital, what needs to be, what we can already envisage that will need to be done in terms of rebuilding and reforming education, health. So it's a book. It's free. You can download it from the website of CEPR.org. And I also want to call attention that there are more contributions to the Ukraine Day that you can find. One is a debate, as we call it. It's shorter contributions on consequences of the war on the Ukraine. All of that is what we have collected under the Ukraine initiative. Now, I am planning to give you a short but also selective overview of what are main key messages of this book, while not covering the ones that my co-authors will be talking about. And I want to start from a point of view that has to do, we all talk a lot about the weather. The weather right now in Stockholm is not quite what I expected. It's not as cold as I expected. Same in Switzerland, by the way, where I spent my Christmas holiday. We did not get snow really on the mountains. But in Kiev, it's cold. I mean, this was the forecast from the weekend when I did these slides, and for Saturday, the forecast was a minus 10 degrees Celsius. And moreover, in the Ukraine, and you may be familiar with this because we are hearing about it every day, since the main infrastructure is constantly under threat, the Ukraine is also rather dark. So you can see this from space. Light intensity in the Ukraine as compared to neighboring countries. And it is worth noting that this is not the way it used to be. This is a consequence of the war as we speak. But there are also, in terms of the consequences, there are also strong consequences for Europe. And I will emphasize a bit the context and the connection with Europe. When I look at the European perspective, in particular, a perspective that is influenced also by the German dependency, I would characterize the what the Ukrainian war, the Russian war has achieved. It has kind of destroyed some of the key beliefs that were strongly held, namely that there would be no more war on the Northern European plain, that one could trust globalization and trade and the strong and close interaction, ever closer interaction, so to say, with Russia, to serve also as a guarantor of preventing conflict. So this I sometimes call the omelette theory of trade. If you trade a lot, then the costs of not trading obviously increase, and they increase so much because, in fact, the omelette cannot be unscrambled. You can't recover the eggs after you have made an omelette. But it also turns out that this is no guarantee for not having armed conflicts or other hostility. The fact that these costs are high economically doesn't seem to imply automatically that they are also as high politically. So this is the map of what is now has been reclaimed by Ukraine in terms of territory and what is still Russian controlled, the red parts, and that amounts to, this is a large area. It is I don't know how much of Sweden it would encompass, but I know that it's about a third of Italy or all of Hungary. That's the size of the territory. And we also have only estimates of the human and economic, and I'm going to then focus on the economic and macroeconomic disasters for going forward. But the human, of course, is much, much larger as a disaster, but also it's asymmetric because the estimated 40,000 civilians have only been killed in the Ukraine. Economically, right now, the estimates are that the cost of the war in GDP terms of last year, that is good news, more close to 30% reduction than 50%. But 30 is a good number to remember also in terms of where inflation stands and where unemployment stands, this despite the fact that many people have left. And the estimates of what the costs is of rebuilding the infrastructure are anywhere between 350, this is from the World Bank and turns out to be a low number, the lower number of the estimates up to $1 trillion US. So absolutely staggering numbers, especially also if you put it into relationship to the size of the Ukrainian economy. Now, this is a busy chart. I want to focus on the main message, which is that the expenditures of the Ukraine, and these are mostly war expenditures, have been larger than their revenues. Their revenues collapse and their expenditures. So the deficit last year on average has been between 3 and 5 billion US dollars. And the problem is that this financing of the deficit is partly and homemade, namely through actual regular revenues. Partly is financed from abroad. And the third part, and that's the next chart, shows who are actually the biggest financiers and in that sense the largest donors financing the Ukrainian deficit, and it's the central bank it's the National Bank of the Ukraine. In other words, the for a good part of last year, the government of the Ukraine had to finance the war through the central bank, the straight monetization of expenditures. Now, of course, this is not sustainable, and that was our main. That was the main background of the report on the macroeconomics of the Ukraine back in July. And the Ukrainians have said consistently, we need to know when help is coming, because if it's not, it's not really helpful if people are committing but then not delivering or not delivering in time. And partly the result has been that inflation, in fact, has been increasing very, very rapidly. And on the one hand side, you see the inflation rate going to about 30%. And on the other hand side, you see the exchange rate. So if you're interested more in the macroeconomics, I encourage you to actually go to that report. The exchange rate was first stabilized at the beginning of the war. But of course, with the very high inflation at home, then you become increasingly overvalued. There was a step devaluation back in July, but this is what you're seeing here. But the market exchange rate, the black market at this stage, is still above the exchange rate. So there are large imbalances, and partly this can be explained by the fact that the budget support that was promised did not arrive in time. So this is the differences between the commitments and the actual disbursements that were paid out. So commitments are in the top chart, and the disbursements are the dark blue ones. And you see that there is quite a large difference, not only in size among countries, but also between what was promised, was committed, and was actually delivered. So the first point is, the Ukraine now has a problem now. So when we're talking about rebuilding, and we're talking about, it's not a question for tomorrow or after the war has started. To actually be able to finance the war. So that was the first point on the macro, and do so in a way that does not lead to macroeconomic crisis. Second, there has to be a constant rebuilding which is happening of the infrastructure that is being destroyed. But moreover, and this is the spirit in which this book is written, we have to be thinking about organizing and making plans for what will be the Ukraine of the future, because there is no point in investing today without a plan of where to go tomorrow. And some of the things that are already clear is that there will have to be a massive reallocation, both in skills, in people, in where they live, and in infrastructure. So this is a massive transformation of the economy that will need to take place. It is also, and this is the positive view, it is also a opportunity to modernize in one go, to go for leapfrog in technologies, smart cities, green energy in future, rather than the very carbon intensive ones. Digitalization and education are just a few keywords where the future of the Ukraine will look, or should look, very different from the past. When we're talking about rebuilding, not everything has to be rebuilt, and certainly it doesn't have to be rebuilt the way it was before. Again, this is but just an example here that is about the railroads, and they have the wrong track and they are Moscow-centric. So the new railroad system will be more oriented towards the west, but only that already is a huge cost of enabling the transportation of goods and services and trade that will be necessary in the future. It's also clear that these costs will not it won't be possible that the official sector and assistance can carry it all. There will be a massive need for private sector investment. And that, of course, is where it's a bit more difficult to actually ask for FDI or to expect a large amount of private longer-term foreign direct investment to flow into the Ukraine right now. But one of the questions in this context is whether risk sharing and guarantees by the international institutions that specialize on these kind of programs should not be put in place right now. Public-private partnerships will be extremely important. And finally, investing in human capital, an education system that leaves behind the former Soviet Union and is completely modernized will be another important point on the reconstruction agenda. In all of this, and especially in thinking about it today, what we are seeing is that there is a lot of goodwill and a lot of commitments to help the Ukraine, but there is not a lot of will among the donors to actually cooperate together. One of the first principles that we wrote up in the already first report, but is reiterated in this book, is about donor coordination and not competition. Every institution that is now deploying some kind of help for the Ukraine and committing resources have their own rules, so that's why it's difficult. That's why it's different from a Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan had one donor and many recipients. Here we have one recipient and many, many donors, and they have been not able so far to agree on a way of governing this help, both for the short, but also more importantly, also for the longer run. So our recommendation has always been there should be an agency, and it can be an independent agency, but it should be very much aligned with the EU accession process, because the way to anchor forward the Ukrainian reform, modernization, and rebuilding is to essentially anchor it into the EU accession process. And that will involve a lot of reforms which come with that. And I expect that Torbjörn will talk about some of those. But it will also provide some of the confidence that is needed for private sector investment to materialize. That was one of the important aspects of the Marshall Plan. It's one of the underestimated ones, but historians tell us that the Marshall Plan did not so much work through the actual funding, but very much also through the frameworks and policy anchors that it provided, that Europe and European countries would go for market economies and would institutionally put their house in that order. So back to Europe, if anchoring to Europe, then what is the European, back to the question, how is Ukraine changing Europe? So I'm using here a quote from The Economist, I think. Yeah, this is the one. Europe has displayed unity, grit, and principled willingness to bear economic costs. The economic costs have been high last year, especially in terms of the price that was paid for the energy dependence and paying any price essentially to fill gas storages in gas-dependent countries like Germany or Italy. And of course, there is a spillover into inflation in the euro area as a consequence. But overall, this will have increased the determination to gain the independence from energy dependence, to decarbonize faster, and ultimately to build up the defense. So this is going to be, in my view, a different Europe going forward too. And with this, I will hand over to Veronika, I think, who is online and will talk about her chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. It's my great pleasure to be with you today, and I will now switch to my presentation and continue talking almost where Beatrice stopped. That is about trade, foreign investment, importance of the private capital, and also importance of the European integration. But before we switch to what we should do, I would like to discuss a bit what Ukraine has already achieved, because in the sphere of foreign trade especially, there have been big changes. Unlike in many other areas, in foreign trade, Ukraine evolved a lot over the last 30 years. Ukraine is a small open economy in terms of economic understanding of these, and it's quite open. Its trade openness is comparable with the EU average, as we can see on this chart. There, Ukraine is a blue line, and European Union is the orange line. However, as many countries that are just building their economies, Ukraine is facing a negative trade balance over most of the time of its independence. Geographically, the changes have been striking, and they are most pronounced since 2014, since the Revolution of Dignity and the start of the war with Russia, basically, because this war, what we see now, is not the completely new situation. It's something that stayed at a low scale since 2014 and regretfully just blown up in February 2022. But if we look at the trade, we see that Ukraine has been moving closer and closer to the European Union, that it became its dominant partner with about 40% of exports and imports by 2021. And at the same time, reducing importance of Russia, which dropped to about 5% of total trade. And that changed not only because like reorientation, but restructuring of trade, the composition, product composition of trade. Ukraine has become the dominant player, one of the dominant players on the food market globally. We all saw that last year. Then the blockade of Black Sea ports stopped flow of grains from Ukraine, and many countries faced huge challenges, including the challenge of hunger. And this change was, these agri-food exports was not only because of like liberalization, although it happened, but also because Ukraine has been very efficient in increasing its productivity. Basically, agriculture, despite some deficiencies and still expected further gains, it changed a lot compared to what we saw after the collapse of the Soviet Union. At the same time, metallurgy has been losing its importance since the global crisis of 2008, 2009, and actually this war just accelerated both these trends, the growing importance of agriculture and the devastating impact of the war and the destructions and blockade on Ukraine's metal production. In service, it was a remarkable change. There's a huge role of IT that's just boosted over last decade, and increasing also the role of business services with a continuous reduction of role of transportation, a lot of which was pipelines, shipping Russian gas and oil to Europe. And we will see the further developments this year. We'll get all statistics because ITC has been growing despite the war in Ukraine. In imports, the major change was a reduced role of energy products with growing energy efficiency. Still, Ukraine is hugely energy inefficient, but compared to what we had 20 years ago, it's a big change. And as a result, Ukraine stopped importing many of energy just to cover its needs, but also Ukraine stopped importing gas from Russia and switched to the European market, facing much more reasonable price formation than the politically driven prices of the Russian gas. In imports, just briefly, the major was the role of tourism, and because of the war in 2022, actually expenditure of Ukrainian refugees in Europe boosted this sector further, but it's natural. If the trade was developing, restructuring, we did not see that in Ukrainian FDIs and basically in Ukrainian domestic investments as well. Ukraine is hugely underfunded. It was underfunded before the war. The share of gross fixed capital formation in GDP was about 12%, which is completely insufficient to any modernization. And in terms of FDI stock, Ukraine is among the lowest in Europe. If you look at the indices, it's many of them. I just highlighted one, the Heritage Foundation, Economic Freedom. If you look trade freedom indexes, it's compared to the Poland above the world average. There are some fluctuations, but in principle, Ukraine is performing well. In investment, it's not the case. The investment freedom in Ukraine remained actually very low. It's an unfree country. And this is one of the major explanations why we did not see the inflow of investments, for example, after the conclusion of association agreement with the EU and the start of the big transformation of the economic policy. Basically, if we look in trade, I have already said that, but it's important to understand that Ukraine has completed a lot of very impressive reforms in trade. The major boost occurred since about 2005, then Ukraine was preparing for WTO accession, and in 2008 became the country that not only allowed for low import duties and non-discriminatory access to most service markets, Ukraine is very open for services, but also it resulted in commitments in transformation, technical barriers, and many other areas related to trade. Ukraine has FTAs, free trade agreements, with over half of its partners, and since 2014, Ukraine is implementing association agreement, including deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, where Ukraine has aligned already most of its technical regulations and standards that is required for product safety with the EU norms. Ukraine will have a huge challenge implementing all the EU accession requirements, but we have to say that in many economic areas, both in standards, also in many key legal things, key legislation, Ukraine has been already living under EU acquis, or very close to what is now in the EU acquis. So here we have to understand that some economic parts have been implemented. We also have a lot of new laws on privatization, on concessions, on foreign investors protection. So we have been trying to push the FDIs, but where we have problems, this is actually fundamentals, and not economic, but political fundamentals. The lack of the rule of law, poor protection of property rights, still high corruption. This is the essence of the problems of Ukraine, and this is why the EU membership perspective is so hugely important, because we can integrate further economically. Association agreement allows us to do that. Ukraine can get for freedoms in principle, but if there is no push for rule of law reforms, if it's no cooperation with the EU and close coordination between government, civil society within the country, we might fail. And that would be very bad news, not only for Ukraine, but I think it will be also for the security and perspective of democratic development of Europe and the world. Basically, I will probably not touch a lot about the challenges in trade. They existed, but they far less fundamental. They are more technical. Do we have TRQs? Are there sufficient number of permits? What is the access to export finance? All hugely important, but far less like strategic. As I already said, the war had impacted Ukraine. Beatrice already said the total GDP drop is about 30%. It is not as bad as we expected, but still terrible. In terms of trade, according to the preliminary results, export of goods dropped by about 35%, while imports only by 20%. You'll see that in December it was a spike of imports. Probably it has to be like distributed more gradually along the year. Here it's only preliminary assessments, but still we see that imports has been recovering faster. And it is a reason for that. I did an analysis. Basically, Ukraine is importing, first of all, intermediate products and capital goods. Purely consumer goods is about 17% of total imports. And some of them are crucial for consumption. So basically, Ukraine needs imports for functioning of its economy, not to satisfy like luxury needs. And with the destruction, the demand for imports even increased because some of the goods that we usually produce, we stopped producing. But still, if we look at the war, it created huge challenges, which are very clear and already discussed partly, but also it created huge new opportunities. It became a trigger for EU decision to provide a candidate status. It's not the reason, I believe, but it's definitely the trigger. EU market has become fully open in terms of duties. All TRQs were removed, all duties were set zero, all safeguard measures were removed. The same or similar measures were taken also by US, Canada, UK. Solidarity lanes initiative on logistics was introduced. The same on logistics was removal of permit requirements, at least till the mid of this year. Ukraine joined the EU customs common transit system, which is the important integration into the Europe customs and ensuring that there is one administrative document, one declaration for shipping goods from any place of Europe till Ukraine or vice versa. There is a free roaming and many other initiatives discussing on the agenda how to integrate. Many of them were in the association agreement, but candidate status definitely gave a push. It's very clear that to get the recovery, Ukraine will need to integrate very closely into the foreign market even further and to attract foreign investments. And Ukraine is expected to have deep integration in the EU market before the membership in the EU per se in this. That is basically envisaged in the association agreement. There will be a new export-oriented trade policy, even further export-oriented, with focus on global value chains, and we also advise on development of diversified exports, trying to identify sectors with lower security risks. We were writing the book before these blackouts in Ukraine, and then ITC looked safer. But what we see now, Ukraine has been importing huge number of generators, and I think Ukraine is one of the leaders in using Starlink. So I suspect that ITC and digital services will continue growing despite hardships. We recommended also continue opening new markets, in particular focusing on the EU trade partners. But the fundamental thing, it will be the changes related to rule of law and property right protection, because that not only fosters trade, It fosters investment, and not only foreign investment, but also domestic investment, because we will need a lot of money. And in order to ensure that they are flowing into the country, we need just these fundamentals. And still, given the security risks are very unlikely to be resolved soon, even if we have some peace agreement. The Russia is here, and the security issues will dominate the agenda. It's important to establish, and we recommend establishing multi-donor fund to cover non-economic risks of investors, to make the country much more efficient in attracting, and much more attractive in FDI, in bringing FDIs to the country. And we think that basically, given the difficulties with channeling huge numbers of money, billions of dollars or euros into country through government and through governmental institutions, will face some capacity constraints. We believe that the public-private partnership or private money should be dominant in recovering in any sector, any sport where it's possible to have some profit. And role of international donors should be, first of all, on technical and financial assistance, especially in reforms related to the EU, implementation of association agreement. There should be multi-donor fund to cover non-economic risk, as I said. There should be some support for business and SME development, targeting, ideally just including Ukraine under the EU umbrella projects and initiatives. And there should be export promotion FDI attraction programs. The cost of which we try to do some estimates. It seems that just the cost for trade and investment policy per se are moderate compared to other costs. 2 billion is not moderate number, but compared to needs, it's small. But associated cost of infrastructure, which is not only for trade, and cost for insurance, these multi-donor insurance fund can make the bill much larger. And last but not least, it's not on the slide, but it's very important that it has to perform a special role, because the Balkan trap, if there is no progress in the session, if it's no clear communication, some motives can be played back and destroy the appetite for reforms. So far, about 80% of population, about 90% want EU membership, but about 80%, 78, require reforms. They understand that reforms will open the accession path. But EU needs appetite for accession as well. And it's very important to demonstrate it and not lose this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Anders is letting me get up here without more clear direction, so I'm just going to start talking like always. First of all, let me just say it's, of course, a huge honor and privilege to have been working on this project together with Beatrice, but also really an amazing set of authors in this book. I don't think we can overstress how many very distinguished economists and policymakers have been involved in this project, but I think also very importantly, how many extremely talented Ukrainian economists and policymakers have been involved here. It's really one of these truly joint projects where we all benefit from working together.
A lot of the stuff that's in the chapter that I've been involved in could not have been written without the very important contributions of Natalia Shapoval and Timofey Milovanov that are at the Kiev School of Economics, and of course know the local context at a completely different level than myself, Giancarlo, and Jonathan that are all here at site, or Giancarlo now in Italy. But so I just want to stress how extremely valuable it is. And I also think this is one of the big points in the reconstruction of Ukraine. There are so many well-educated and smart people in Ukraine that want to be part of this process themselves. They don't want us Westerners explaining everything to them. You know, more than one time when we had this discussion about Ukraine, I hear the term West-splaining. I'm sure you have heard that in this discussion. And I think, you know, the fact that CEPR made a very conscious effort to pair together Ukrainians and people like myself in these different chapters of this book is really something that we should all appreciate, because I think that's really a key contribution when it comes to how this process has worked. Anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about now the anti-corruption policies in the reconstruction of Ukraine. We have already heard here, you know, some of the fundamental reforms that are needed, and as soon as you talk about any type of support to Ukraine, if there's no Ukrainian in the room, it literally takes 2 seconds before someone says, "What about corruption?" You know, so this is a question that we need to address. It's something that, you know, if you look back to the IMF, World Bank, EU discussions with Ukraine, it's always there on the first page of any report, you know, dealing with corruption and rule of law. So with this in mind, it's obviously not an easy task. All right. Do I need some technical support of you, Dominic? No, this works. Okay. So if we think about the overall framework here, what we were focusing on was, of course, a large literature about corruption in all sorts of settings. So we tried to condense some of these different insights from lots of different places, lots of institutional setups. Started to work on this chapter. The first is actually almost at you know, a silly level: remove opportunities for corruption and rent extraction. But it is actually a very fundamental principle, because it points us in directions on where we want to target some of these reforms. It's your usual thing that the opportunity makes the thief or something like that. So, you know, really thinking about what are the different sectors of the Ukrainian economy or the institutions where corruption happens, and try to think about how we can eliminate those opportunities that we have seen in the past. Of course, we all also think in terms of monitoring and transparency when it comes to dealing with corruption. That needs to be a critical part on any of these reform efforts. As part of that, we think it's very important that, you know, this already starts with education in schools and in different other settings where you know, everyone talks about corruption and why it's not okay and what are the bad consequences of corruption. And then, of course, we don't think, you know, that magically is going to take away all of the corruption. So we still really need to focus on having the anti-corruption and legal institutions there to take care of corruption cases when they're still going to occur. You know, so that's the general thinking about how to deal with corruption in Ukraine. And I think this is sort of quite general points from the whole literature on corruption. And just to set the stage, we can measure corruption in a lot of different ways. This is a chart with 3 different measures of corruption. I put them all there just to show you that, you know, we can argue with it, which is the right measure, but they all provide roughly the same picture at the end of the day. So Ukraine is the blue bar, and here you want to be the tallest bar. That's the good guys. And I've taken Ukraine and compared it with transition countries. And the red bars are the transition countries that came out of the Soviet Union. And the gray bars are the transition countries that then became EU members. And it's pretty obvious that Ukraine has historically been quite close in terms of corruption indicators with other countries coming out of the Soviet Union. And this really is, you know, the unfinished transition, if you want. We're here at the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics. This is really the unfinished transition that a lot of these post-Soviet states have to deal with. But we can also see that the ones that chose to enter into the EU have made much more progress than some of these other transition countries here. So how has it actually worked? What are the institutions and processes that are at the heart of the corruption problems historically in Ukraine? And I have to say, this is one typical thing where you really need to have your Ukrainian co-authors. I could not sit here and understand all of these processes. So, you know, but what we have been discussing in this chapter is that one regular institution or process is basically how you appoint people to become the CEOs of the state-owned enterprises. And some of you may know that there's a lot of state-owned enterprises in Ukraine. Some of them are very big. They have big turnovers, lots of money in and out of these organizations. So, you know, how we appoint CEOs, boards, key people in state-owned enterprises is one way of either limiting how much money you can sort of steal from a state-owned company, or, you know, putting your own guys in there. So this is something we have to watch about. But then it's also in the government, it's in the regulators, and it's in the court. So it's going to be extremely important to think about how appointments to these key positions are made in the future. It needs to be much more merit-based, transparent, etc. Then the other thing is that when you deal with corruption, it's also important how you control information flows. And in the past, I'm sure a lot of you know that major TV channels, etc., was connected to specific business interests and oligarchs that in turn were then connected to different political players. So thinking about how this is going to be dealt with in the reconstruction is also going to be important. Then, of course, financing of the political system. This is a quite complicated issue, actually. Because in Ukraine, there has been this very strong tie between oligarchs and the political system. I remember when I came here to CEPR in 2006, one of the first things people were telling me about Ukraine before I really had been there myself is that outside the Ukrainian parliaments, there were more Rolls-Royces parked than anywhere in the world outside parliaments. You know, so understanding how these connections work is also very important. And this then requires actually thinking seriously about this, because also here in Sweden, or if you think about the US, UK, we have very different systems in terms of how our politicians funded. We cannot be naive and think that politics doesn't need money. We know that to run campaigns, you need funding. But how do you do that in a transparent manner that's not encouraging corruption and later on appointments into key positions? And then, of course, it's your usual way of bribing law enforcement, institution, courts, etc. If we think about a little bit more specifically how these things have worked in Ukraine, one of the big things has been how banks have been recapitalized. Ukraine had a ridiculous number of banks in terms of size of the economy, etc. But a lot of them were then connected again to specific business interests that were basically using some of these banks as their own wallets and basically taking out funds whenever they liked, and then they could be recapitalized by common means. The other thing, like in a lot of different places, procurement. Most societies have quite a good chunk of businesses that are connected to municipalities, to the government, to state organizations, etc. And how you actually organize procurement linked to these institutions is one source of corruption, and so also in Ukraine in the past. Then you have other things like how you regulate tariffs to large monopolies. You have, setting up markets in a way that they're not competitive, but it gives a certain state-owned enterprise some type of monopoly that they can misuse. And you skip paying taxes, etc., etc. So these were some of the, more practical ways of getting funding from sort of the public domain into private hands in ways that we would not think is okay, which is basically corruption. I maybe should mention that corruption is defined in a little bit different ways depending on who you ask. But here, the general thing is just misusing public funds for some private gains. That's the bigger concept, but we can be much more specific about that, of course. If you look at some different indicators of institutional quality in Ukraine, this is the green line here is control of corruption. And we can see, of course, that it started out at the really low level. And it's working its way up, but we also have some ups and downs. And if you look closely at this chart, we can see that it goes down when Yanukovych was in the office, and then actually it starts to. So what happened then since the revolution of dignity? Because again, this upward movement was basically in connection to changing that precedent out of the system. So a couple of things that they did back then was actually to clean up the banking system. That had been one of the ways of sort of stealing money from the public coffers. They also upgraded the procurement system. They introduced something called Prosoro, which was actually a quite modern thing, and it's actually more advanced than the procurement systems that we have in a lot of the EU countries. They spend quite a lot of efforts into digitalization. So, making sure that you don't have to interact with too many public officials once you need a document or some license or something. There have been some reforms of the state-owned enterprises. It's not a done deal for sure. And there has been a lot of discussions around anti-corruption institutions. But that last thing has been quite complicated. And it's one of the recurring discussions that Ukraine had with the IMF, for example, before the war. So, between the revolution of dignity and the outbreak of the full-scale invasion, there had been a lot of progress. So corruption was lowered, but problems remained. And just to give you a sense, what happened to some of these indicators. So this is basically, we can see that bribery was reduced by 25%. And some of these standard indicators of corruption improved by maybe 30 to 50, 60%. So the thing is that these improvements were done from a relatively low base, but it's not true that, like in some reports, they say nothing has changed in Ukraine. I think it's quite obvious that things did change in Ukraine between the revolution and dignity and today. But it's sort of an unfinished agenda, if you like, still. So what now happened in the war? We have a stronger state, of course. Some of the oligarchs, or quite a few of the oligarchs, have seen their positions weaken dramatically. The government has centralized media, so you cannot use, media narratives for your own business interests. There has been changes in how you trade with oil and gas, and of course the whole Russian dimension that has been also, a fight in this political and business environment. That dimension has been eliminated. Then also, I think there are still examples, of course, of corruption happening also in wartime. But on the grander scale, I think a lot of policymakers and people now fighting for the survival of the country realizes that they cannot steal money from the public domain for their own interest, because if they do that on a big scale, they're basically going to lose the war. So it's a very harsh conditionality right now during the war in terms of not misusing the common funds, basically. I think we should have some time for question. There's a lot of different historical cases and a lot of lessons learned. We go through some of this in the chapter, and you can have a look if you want to think about what we should have added for Ukraine from that perspective. But if I instead now just focus a few minutes on what we think will be the key elements when it comes to anti-corruption in the reconstruction of Ukraine, the first really central point is that donor coordination that we heard about already is going to be central. We're talking about hundreds of billions of euros, potentially over a 10-year period, coming to Ukraine. If this is done in bits and pieces with lots of different reports and monitoring and etc., it's going to be a disaster. It's really going to be exactly providing opportunities for corruption. So, one of the central things here is that removing opportunities for corruption when it comes to reconstruction really needs to be based on having one centralized platform where we can have common plans, we can have common monitoring, a lot of transparency when it comes to how these funds are used. This is going to be critical. And then, of course, procurement has improved a lot, but there still in the past have been a good chunk of projects financed out or procured outside of this ProSoro system. We need to bring more of it into a streamlined procurement system to reduce those opportunities. Then there is another issue I just want to touch on here, which is there's a lot of discussion about corruption in Ukraine, and some people say, why don't we let sort of the Swedish companies or the Swiss companies or the German companies just go to Ukraine and fix everything, We don't actually give the money to Ukraine, but we bring our companies to do that. So two big problems with that. First of all, our companies are usually not always great in terms of corruption. We have a lot of stories about our own companies. When they're not doing business at home, they're not always the best performing in terms of not doing corrupt stuff abroad, just so we remember that, The other thing is, of course, that it may be very expensive to do it only with our own firms. So we should really also use this reconstruction as a way of making sure that the Ukrainian companies get back to their feet and become part of this process. That's pretty obvious, but it's also going to be cheaper. So, we really need to find ways of letting them be part of this. And I'm stressing this a little bit here because if you do some of the regular procurement things, you have to look back and see what is the financial history of a company for them to be eligible to be part of these procurement deals. And of course, what Ukraine now is going through is a lot of businesses that are going to have a lot of financial problems. Or they will have to restart, they will not even have a financial history. So we have to think about, in smart ways, how can they be part of this procurement and reconstruction process, despite the fact that they may not have this financial history that we would usually require. And obviously, we need to involve local communities, civil societies, all of these things to make sure that we have this monitoring and transparency that we think are critical. I have already mentioned state-owned enterprises, banks, etc. One additional thing is that we may need to want to think about civil service reforms as well. There's a lot of discussions about how much do you have to pay civil servants to reduce sort of their incentives to be corrupt, etc. I think other people have dealt with this in their chapters, but just to mention that that's also going to be an issue. The final thing I want to touch on is that we think that Ukraine becoming an EU member can be helpful when it comes to building its institutions. It's going to be a good guidance in terms of what reforms are needed, how we set up institutions, including the ones to deal with corruption. So if we look at the past experience of countries joining the EU, these are the EU 11 countries that I had in my previous slide. And the dark or the thicker line here is basically what happened on average with a corruption indicator when countries join the EU. And I set sort of the bar here is when countries become members of the EU. And we can see that, it does take some time for countries to become less corrupt, even when they enter the EU. It's not like everything happens in the process before you enter the EU that we may hope for, but movements in this. So I think also we should understand with Ukraine, we cannot just say that this is going to be taken care of by the EU accession process. They will have to do a lot of homework themselves. They have a lot of catching up to do when it comes to these corruption indicators. The EU is going to certainly help and be a good guiding light for the reforms, but a lot of these things needs to be done by the Ukrainian society that actually wants to rebuild their country in a non-corrupt way. And I think we were talking about opportunities before. This really is an opportunity for Ukraine to break with the corrupt past and move to new equilibrium. This is also one of these theory literature about corruptions that in a lot of cases, you can show that you can have one equilibrium with very high corruption because everyone thinks that everyone else is corrupt. And you need something really drastic to move people to an equilibrium where we expect everyone else to not be corrupt and then ourselves not be corrupt. And I think, what we see here is exactly this opportunity for Ukraine to move from a high corruption equilibrium to a low corruption equilibrium. But, it's going to take a lot of education, information, transparency, etc. As a final little marketing. You can think of this as maybe the price for being here today. I want to tell you that we are also doing things to help the Kyiv School of Economics down in Ukraine. They really need our support in lots of different ways. So we started here an ideell förening called Friends of KC. I would just urge you to check out if you're interested in helping both financially, intellectually, or in other ways. This is something you can have a look at. So, thank you.
Thank you. All right, so Torbjörn and Beatrice, why don't you join me up here? Yeah. And so I want to make sure that everybody knows that they have an opportunity to ask questions as well. And that includes also those of you who are with us online. Hopefully the technology will help us so I can get those questions as well. But I just wanted to kick off with one question. So the ambition in this book is, of course, very broad and kind of long-reaching, talking about reconstruction for the future. But if you think in the more shorter run, so I mean, if you think about the current situation where we're still at war, and if we think about the initial stages of a reconstruction during peacetime, what would you argue would be the most prioritized areas, both for investments and in terms of reforms from the Ukrainian side? And this, I'm asking this to all of you.
I can maybe start by saying, why don't you start?
All right.
I'll explain it on again.
So, I mean, the first thing I think in all of this is we need to remember that to have any reconstruction of Ukraine, it needs to still exist as a country. I mean, that's kind of the obvious thing. So making sure that we actually support Ukraine in all possible ways to make sure it survives the war. That's sort of the number one priority. And I don't think that's something we should, ask them to do specific reforms for us to support them. We really need to support them here and now. And if we don't do that, it's an enormous risk, not only to people in Ukraine, but it's actually an enormous risk to us if we don't do that. So I think, that's something, it's kind of trivial, but it's worth repeating, because every time we have a discussion like this, external support needs to be the first thing we talk about. And the other thing I think you saw in Veronika's chart, the spike in imports. And we had the discussion of how you finance the budget deficit. In terms of both domestic balance and inflation, but also external balance and exchange rate, Ukraine really needs foreign exchange. That's how you pay for imports that are much bigger than exports. So, we need to send a lot of money their way, and then people that do military stuff can talk about what we need to send them in terms of Leopard tanks or other things.
Beatrice, you want to add something?
Well, I would have actually gone in the same direction. Yuri Gorodnichenko, who is one of the leaders of all these projects, he usually has a first slide, which I should have put up and omitted to put up, is namely the way to reduce the costs of what we'll be rebuilding is to be able to help Ukraine now to keep the costs that are occurring every day now to a minimum. In other words, we have to put them in a situation where they can win this war, including the war that is coming from the constant bombardment of their critical infrastructure. So the less destruction there is of the economy and of the country, the lower the cost of rebuilding will be. So the number one thing is support now, and that includes the military, but it also includes, and I want to re-emphasize this, it includes a lot of foreign money, foreign reserves, cash. They need about, for the budget itself, next year about 38 billion US dollars is the estimate. Of course, those are huge numbers. I was at a donor conference in Berlin not too long ago, and one representative of a country stood up and said, you know, we don't even have, we have about 700 million of total foreign aid for all countries. So the numbers we are talking here about in terms of needs for supporting the budget. So and this we're talking about now, we're talking about tomorrow, they are enormous. Now the European, the EU has committed to actually provide 18 billion, which is the rest should come from the US and from other partners and friends of the Ukraine. But it's not only, again, not only a question of commitment, it actually has to be delivered, and there has to be a delivery which is predictable, where they are not in a situation where they have to go to the central bank to finance the expenditures and when the reserves decline and inflation increases. So at the short run, the macro situation, the financing of the war and of the deficit is priority. But this does not mean that it is also, as reconstruction happens every day, as things are being repaired, already all of this should be seen within a view of where is the future going. And it's not just a view of what was there in the past. One of the big things that really strikes me as absolutely relevant is the massive reallocation that will have to happen. People that are now internally displaced, not all of them will go back to where they came from. Some of the areas that are destroyed will not be rebuilt, not only not the way that they were before. So there is a new Ukraine which is already being constructed in that sense as we speak. And then there is also, of course, the question of all the refugees, millions of refugees that are still in the rest of Europe. How are they being integrated into this? How do they still participate in schooling? How do they communicate with their families back home? What is what kind of infrastructure is needed for that? So a lot has to happen now, and again, and ultimately, an agency that takes care of this sort of long-term planning is necessary now.
So, Veronika, do you want to add something?
Yes, basically, I fully agree, and I'm really grateful for Torbjörn and Beatrice for their points, which I fully share. The military support to ensure victory of Ukraine is crucial, and the immediate funding of the needs is equally crucial for making Ukraine like the state, but I'm pretty sure Ukraine will exist, but also to recover quicker after the victory. And here I want to make 2 points. One is something that I learned in the Chatham House event in December, also discussing reconstruction of Ukraine. And I don't have proper answer, but what struck me in the discussions there that both Ukraine and Europe, they are following Russia, basically. They impose the agenda. They are destroying Ukrainian infrastructure. They are, and we are all reacting. Then we are supplying generators, transformators. We should be a bit more like proactive, thinking ahead of Russia, preventing destruction. Beatrice said that partly. Shielding Ukraine, and that will allow us a slightly more predictable future, even in this hugely unpredictable atmosphere that will allow reconstruction and thinking how to rebuild, already taken into account the vision and also EU standards happen now. But also, being Ukrainian, I allow myself saying that reforms are needed now despite the war, despite the huge stress, despite the budget deficit and all of that, because if we make the sequential steps, not a parallel developments, the whole story will be longer and we might lose momentum. And Ukraine is actually understanding that. If we look at these 7 recommendations that European Commission imposed as the precondition for accession talks, so these are recommendations related, first of all, to judicial reform, anti-corruption efforts, and media reform, basically fixing or start fixing some of the fundamental problems. Ukraine has delivered, not even talk to civil society, not entirely, not in the full-scale debates, but it has been a major step made. And it's important, alongside with the military help, with the humanitarian help, with the financial help, to help to keep a pace with these reforms. I think these 7 recommendations is a good start, as well as actually implementing association agreement, because why Ukraine dropped not only by 30%, partially because we had experts, we had opportunity to trade with the world, and we had opportunity to trade closer with the EU. EU became the largest trading partner. It's not 40, it's 63% now. So we should keep up with all of that. It's difficult, but it's possible.
Thank you. So with that, I want to open up to the floor. So do we have any questions? Okay, you're going to get a microphone here so that the audience on the online also hear your questions.
I can start without the microphone. When I watch TV and so on, it's often struck by the lack of information about how much infrastructure and housing is destroyed. Is it like Germany, Berlin, 1945, or is it Finland after the Second World War? How big is that problem? The other thing is that I think that your contribution here is the discussion about corruption. I thought that was very, very interesting. And my first question is, when you have CEPR, what are the general public's attitude to corruption? Is it something that is necessary, or we cannot avoid it, or what is a genuine public desire to get rid of it? Also among the political parties and others. And my third point is, it's more of a political point, and I'm a politician also. So there's a lot of very good information about how the Ukraine can join the European Union. I'm all for it, 150%. But I think in reality, it will be very important for the United States. They have the money, they have the power of let's say my oldest man, the one who decides, and what they will do. And if the Republicans in the United States take over, they are much more lukewarm to Ukraine than the present administration. So I'm not too much emphasis on Europe, but also on the United States, the role of that. And you have many American authors in the book.
So we can take one more question over here, and then we can.
Thank you. I also have a matching comment and question about corruption. I was really enjoying your storyline, Torbjörn, when you were talking about corruption, especially the part when you said that after Revolution of Dignity and after Yanukovych ran away, basically, this is the point when we start seeing the improvement and also in the indexes. And I think this is also very important because it indicates the first proper detachment from Russian influence, because Ukraine is corrupted for a reason. We are going, apart from being in a hot war with Russia, we also finalizing our decolonization process at the moment. And we've been basically colony. I'm from Ukraine, so that's why I say you this pronoun. We've been Russian colony for 400 years with different phases of, nationalist movements trying to fight for independence. But we cannot say that we stopped being Russian colony in 1991 when Soviet Union collapsed. Neither other countries that you show in the statistics, these are post-Soviet countries, most of them still under very heavy Russian influence. And when you look at the Rolls Royces next to the parliament, you should also look at whether this specific MP is connected to oligarchs who then connected to Russia. So there's a lot of Russian representation and still sitting there even during the war, unfortunately. So this is a big part of this. And I thought maybe the whole decolonization literature and examples in history, case studies, it can be helpful for understanding why corruption is there, how it manifests itself culturally, politically, economically, but also what can we expect to happen with this corruption progress once we decolonize from Russia completely. Because, for example, there are a lot of literature how former European colonies suffer from degradation of elites and corruption, because this is exactly what metropoly does on purpose. It degrades and destroys elites, and Ukraine, the quality and the level of corruptedness of our elites, it's exactly the result of this process. So just wanted to point out, and maybe just very tiny question also to Beatrice, when you had this slide that was called Disasters of War, human aspect or human dimension, and you did not mention deportations there. I also noticed that in the book you mentioned it very briefly in the footnote, while we know that deportation is also one of the signs of genocide, and it's estimated that it's around 2 million and 3 million women that were deported from Ukraine to Russia, and around 400-700 million of children. So this is a huge loss for our demography. So I wonder, and of course it's a very tricky question because it's they are there forcefully deported. It's not like refugees who move to other countries because of war, but also they have freedom of will to return or to settle down in other countries. While with deported, it's a completely different story. So how do you treat this part? And also when we say that if Ukraine occupies the territories, people are basically stolen. They cannot so easily come back home even if they want. So this is a very big dramatic part, of course, on the human level, but on the economic level, how do you deal with the deportations part? Thank you.
Yes, please.
Can I just take a quick stab at your first thing, how estimates are developed in terms of what's damaged? So the Kyiv School of Economics is doing exactly that. They are monitoring both with satellite images, with drones, and with sort of humans going into different registers to get an idea of these numbers. So the latest estimate I remember is from maybe November, which was 136 billion. Roads, buildings, all of these things. Of course, these numbers, you saw 350 to 1 trillion from Beatrice, and these numbers include a lot of different things then, because you also have loss of life, you have loss of income, you have loss of exports, etc. So it depends a bit then what we include when we say what is destroyed. So, but the best estimate I know for just destruction of infrastructure, that would be the Kyiv School of Economics, and then we're talking maybe 150 billion US dollars today, but yeah, that's the ballpark.
Yes, I have nothing to add to that. I think that is the best estimate that I know of. Clearly, what is being destroyed and what is happening on a daily basis is also something that is not published for good reasons. So it's part of the of essentially the war effort to not be too clear about what is going on in terms of the destruction. But I had one question that I made, and afterwards maybe Veronika can also take that one up. But on the deportations, so I mean, in the book or I mean, we don't do any long-run estimates of potential growth or anything like that. That would not be very reasonable. But how would you deal economically with the deportations? Well, it's a reduction in the labor force. That's the economic answer, right? So you have fewer people that are actually producing and working, and then questions will depend on what kind of people are they and what is their education, etc. But I would actually see the human cost of what you were mentioning as the more important point, and that one we cannot quantify. So I would, and it's a good point. I think we probably should take it up and look at it in more detail. If the numbers are as large as you say, then it's clearly significant. And one point about institutional reform, if I understood, it was a little bit soft, so I wasn't sure I understood you correctly, but I thought your question was whether the EU actually has appetite for enlargement and whether they mean it. That was not the question. Okay, then maybe you'll have to repeat it.
But I think you talked about the US should be in the driver's seat more than the EU.
I see.
I think that was one of your points that, and I think we have had a lot of discussions about this, and the simple reason for putting EU in the driver's seat is that they are the ones setting up all of the reform targets for Ukraine. You know, Ukraine is still in Europe and can never become one of the states of the United States. So, you know, we need to think about reforms that make Ukraine part of the European Union. It doesn't mean that we would exclude people from the US. It could even be, you know, the head of this organization could be an American just to balance things out. But again, you know, it needs to have a pretty strong EU connection because of the reform process that we're thinking about. Maybe something also about corruption. There's a lot of different things I think we could have added in this corruption chapter, and you know, I think what you talked about, decolonization and the connection to Russia, I would be quite hopeful in this, exactly what I was mentioning, moving from sort of a high corruption equilibrium to low corruption equilibrium, exactly because I see a lot of civil society, you know, researchers and others talking about these issues. And I don't think it's going to be acceptable for people in Ukraine or to even politicians to steal common funds that are needed for reconstruction. I think that I'm hoping that's going to be, you know, a uniting force that we want to create the Ukraine for the future with this money and not steal it and run off to Cyprus or something. But yeah.
Veronika, you want to add something?
Probably very few, because I agree with Torbjörn and Beatrice. Basically about demography, probably it's one of the major challenges that we will see in the future, because it became very different, first in terms of like who remained and how it's placed in Ukraine, but also who left, because of the war, we have the outflow of mainly women of reproductive age and children. It's both like the refugees in Europe, so people who left willingly, and a lot of deportation. And also we have to understand that some of people willingly left to Russia in this wave of like moving out of the war, fleeing out of the war. And it's a human issue. It's definitely the deportation to Russia. It's a genocide, at least what I heard from a legal point of view, as far as I understood that. But economically, it means that the demography was difficult before. Before, it was a huge part of the adult aged people, and the pressure on the working age people to keep all the pensioners was huge, and the Ukraine was always for last 30 years below any reasonable like reproductive level. In order to keep up the population, we need about 2.3, I think, children per woman. We have about 1.3, sometimes 1.7, never even up to 2. Now with this outflow of women and children, it's a huge problem for labor force. It's a huge problem for the future, for education system now, for health, for taxation, for everything. I think one of the solutions would be the modernization, this huge robotization. It will be a huge shift in the how we produce to keep up with that. It will be definitely changes in migration policy. And I hope that the membership in the EU or the clear perspective, we have a clear perspective, but like time clear perspective, because now we have the promise, but it can take from 5 to 25 years or never, or as with Turkey, or close to never. In order to allow people to move freely between Ukraine and Europe. Because if, as soon as it is a clear decision, you have to stay here or return with no clear perspective, I suspect that many families will stay in EU. They are already integrated in the EU working market. Children are already in the school system in universities. We should attract adventurous Europeans to come to Ukraine. We should attract other people from other countries to come to Ukraine to work. Otherwise, the development, we will just not be able to come to the long-term development. But it's a huge question. Thank you for asking it.
Thank you. So when organizing events like these, you always feel that you have a lot of time when you organize it, but then of course you realize at the point of time that, you know, maybe you should have given it a little bit more extra time because we're already out of time here. But the good thing is that we have this little mingle outside afterwards, so there are more opportunities for you in the room to ask questions to the presenters. But I wanted to bring up, since the people on Zoom cannot join us out there, I just wanted to bring up one question from the Zoom room to make sure they feel included. So Heinz Sjögren, who is representing Swedish business interest in the region, is emphasizing, first of all, the importance, of course, of private capital, but he's also mentioning the importance of making sure that the governments contribute through different kind of risk mitigation strategies or export credit guarantees and things like that. And if I understand his question correctly, he's asking, why are you emphasizing this as a kind of multi-donor centralized agency rather than exploiting the knowledge that already exists in national agencies of these kinds in Sweden, and I'm sure in other parts of Europe and in the US as well? What would be the benefit of centralizing this in one central agency?
You want to give Veronika, since she presented that, but you know, I can also answer.
Yeah, I mean, Veronika, do you feel up to answer that, or?
I can try, but also I will be grateful if Beatrice then supports me. Ukraine has export credit agency, but it's been very recently established, and only in 2022 the export credit agency was updated to be more in line with rules of OECD rules and generally be more like pro-Western, pro-European. But export credit agency is already working with the support of the European technical assistance. We will need to expand its activity because currently it's a very small scale compared to the size of the current Ukrainian experts, and we need to plan for more if we need the recovery.
So maybe I can add that, well, it's correct that all countries, a lot of countries have their own export guarantee schemes, and some of them also are able to cover risks of conflict. It would be a problem if the reconstruction or the investment in the Ukraine happened under competing, different countries essentially competing for their firms getting into pole position for attractive projects. That is not the way that we want to be thinking about rebuilding the Ukraine, neither with the public nor with the private money. It goes back to the idea we need some kind of master plan. And then, of course, you want to organize competition in the country, you want to organize competition around procurement, etc. But it should not be a competition among donors for whose companies get into pole position.
Okay, so with that, I think we need to close the event. So thank you very much, Beatrice. Thank you, Veronika.